Anyway, Heather Meeker, who was planning to be the moderator, was the one who was going to give us some background kind of on the Healthcare.gov rollout and kind of some of the glitches, and then was going to throw it to Sue and myself to kind of talk about best practices and some of the specifics of what went wrong and what might have been able to be done better, and kind of lessons to be taken away from that from the standpoint of these sort of development deals. And you know, this was obviously a development that was very high profile and related to a website, but it's really kind of much more of a lesson about kind of projects, big development projects in general, whether they're about websites or whether they're about large outsourcing deals, whether they're about SaaS sort of projects or even non-software related kind of large IT developments. At the end of the day, the lessons here really kind of are ones that we think kind of extend relatively broadly to lots of different sort of development projects. And so we'd like to kind of use this, you know, not really to talk about Obamacare or about the particular portal here, but to use it as a context and a framework to really talk about kind of what can go wrong with these really large and complex development deals and maybe some best practices and lessons about kind of how we can avoid those sort of issues arising in our own deals that we do from time to time. So before we kind of jump in, I'd like to have Sue give a little bio about herself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel. I am a senior director, senior counsel at SanDisks Corporation. It is a flash memory and devices company in Milpitas here. It's been around for 25 years, and most of the devices and most of the flash memory patents actually were started by folks in our company, by our founders. So you may have heard about us, and you may be using our products right now. Most likely you are. So anyways, I was invited here. Part of my role at SanDisk is I run the procurement, supply chain operations. My group covers all of those kinds of deals that include some very large outsourcing deals, other kinds of right sourcing deals. Those kinds of vendor management is part of my responsibility. I also cover privacy, consumer issues, the consumer privacy group. I am the chair of that, as well as dealing with all of our supply chain. So we're very used to doing very large deals, and what goes wrong, what goes right, it really starts from the beginning. So I think that's part of why I was asked to do this. I've been at SanDisks for 7 years. Before that, I was with Sun Microsystems. And I guess, is that it? Yeah.
That's great.
I appreciate being here.
Very briefly, I'm a partner at WilmerHale. I spent the last 20 years kind of doing technology deals of various sorts, usually kind of larger and more complex deals that kind of really are driven by or focused on kind of the development, distribution, or licensing of technology. And so that was kind of my context for being involved in this. I've certainly negotiated my share of these kind of large outsourcing projects that try to address up front the sort of risks and issues that we see kind of from time to time, and we saw in particular in the Healthcare.gov rollout. You know, I think, you know, the press really spent a lot of energy kind of talking about kind of how poorly this rollout went, you know, highlighting every glitch that happened when this rollout occurred. You know, but to be honest, for those of us that have been doing these deals for many years, at the end of the day, it wasn't that surprising to kind of see some of the issues that arose. These are the kinds of issues that certainly arise all the time with the sort of development deals that we do. And so the only real difference here was the profile of these deals, the fact that the public really got to see kind of the sausage being made here, really got to see, you know, kind of these sort of failures on kind of, you know, an epic scale and with a spotlight shown on every one of these failures. The reality is the reason that we, you know, have such complex contracts and negotiations for these sorts of outsourcing and development deals is because in the real world, these issues actually do arise. They actually, do come to fruition, and you actually do have these sorts of problems. If these sort of problems didn't arise on a regular basis in these complex deals, the sort of complex 100-plus page kind of outsourcing contracts that are necessary to kind of manage these deals probably wouldn't be necessary. And so, at the end of the day, if you think about kind of every major rollout of Windows or every major rollout of kind of large office suites or major applications that are rolled out across, the Fortune 500 companies, we don't kind of see all of these same issues popping, but the reality is many of the same issues, if we kind of shone the same spotlight on those other rollouts, would have seen a lot of the same sorts of issues. Sometimes they pop earlier because these commercial rollouts happen with large beta programs before there are actual commercial rollouts, which wasn't really as viable of an option in this circumstance. But at the end of the day, one of the big takeaways for me was that if you kind of compared this to a commercial rollout of a large-scale project, at the end of the day, it wasn't that different in either the scale or number of problems that arose. It was just, at the end of the day, something that really, had a lot bigger spotlight shown on it.
So the format we're going to use here is we're just going to identify a few of the problems that were, given a lot of press, and we also threw our looks. And then we're going to then discuss a few things about how we might have been able to mitigate that. So for those of you who just didn't see the news on this, the Affordable Care Act had an edict to put and make available for folks to be able to sign up. And there were deadlines. And if people did not sign up, if they needed to, they would be penalized. So it was a really high visibility as well as high risk for many, many people if they could not get into the tool or they could not sign up by virtue of the act. So what the government ended up doing, apparently, through some research, what we were able to find, or at least was reported by the Washington Post, was that there was a full review of different vendors. They needed to be government entities, government contractors, and they went through a full RFP. But what went wrong? We found a wonderful graphic, and this we thought we would just at least give you the update. Thank you. First and foremost, anybody in the room try it? Did you have this experience? Okay. Yeah, you might actually be able to jump in and give some thought here. But from what we're seeing and from this article, the company that actually got the bid was CGI Federal. They are back east, and they had done some work before for the government so that they had some history. However, they were chosen, it appears, on the basis of price, more so than maybe their ability to really get the job done. And in fact, there seemed to be some rumblings, at least in this article, that there was history of failed attempts with the retirement website for federal employees. However, what they did is they started off with the front door, and the login portal required that right from the start you were authenticated, and they had to go back and find you in very large-scale databases. This was even before you could just find out, what do I have to do? And this is just, as we all know, especially in Silicon Valley here, that is just not how you design a website. So the problem there was, they really needed a feature to just say, I want to shop. I want to know what I have to do. Secondly, the communication in many of the back-end systems just weren't working. So can we scoot down?
You want to scroll down?
Yeah, scroll down, just to summarize some of the problems. There was a lot of waiting. You had to prove your identity. You had to give the eligibility way up front before you could truly figure out what you couldn't do. Most people want a comparison shop. So this did a really good job of explaining that. So now back to, kind of the problem statement. So it appeared that, according to the Act, it was in danger of being undone because this tool did not allow people to sign up. So how do you deal with the broken launch? So with that, I'll just make mention that the one thing when you hear about a client or a project like this, if you're a government procurement entity, the most important thing, you're going to really want to know your end game. What's going on? How many people are you going to need to service with this site? What is today's estimate, but what's the future estimate? Where do you think you need this site to go? What do you need from your vendor? So that is absolutely critical. And if you want it to be really cool and enticing, this is your job, or the manager, the program manager's job, to set out all of those specifications very early on in a vision document. It could be, don't be limited. The thing that people sometimes get limited by what they can do. The point of a vision document is, even if you don't think it's possible, to at least document it. Because you never know, the vendor or whoever you choose to help you here, or your own developers, may just come up with something really cool. Also, know your partner. So we do know that what the government did was they did put this out to bid. There were about, I believe the article said 13, they nailed it down to 7, came down to 4. So it was certainly that kind of a process. We can't say that didn't happen. But the reputation, they did not pay as much attention, it appears, to the background information that said that they had kind of botched a couple of other projects. There was some rumbling of it being political. This started back in 2007, so it really was kind of cross administrations, because the Obama administration came in 2008, but apparently there were some other projects that they were working with this vendor in 2007. So, you know, at the end of the day, they were already looking at improving the Medicare and Medicaid signups, and so that was where this got started. The third thing is to know your milestones, and then the last and most important thing is plan for the inevitable. It doesn't appear that they planned for the inevitable. They didn't plan for things being, you know, perhaps getting bogged down, you know, that things maybe the vendor couldn't perform by that date. This was a date certain. There was no coming back and saying, oh, let's delay for a month. That just wasn't going to happen, especially with the political environment.
That's great, Sue. You know, kind of backing up, you talked about at the beginning kind of your vision and the specifications. Can you talk about kind of, you know, what are best practices for an RFP process for kind of putting out what you need, you know, at a front end, kind of describing to your vendors absolutely what you need from a specification perspective? What do you need from a, you know, what do you need from a front end kind of demands for the expertise in the vendors? Can you just describe the RFP process as you see it, as it should have been done, and as kind of you think best practices should be from that perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to tell you what I see as best practices. But I will preface, these are my opinions, not the opinions of my company. And, you know, and in some cases, you know, not being a government employee myself involved in the procurement, I am just from an outsider in responding to that comment. I do believe the government has a very robust procurement process. By law, they need to have a very robust procurement process. But sometimes the people forget the forest for the trees. It's so complex. And there are so many rules and things that government contractors have to go through that they oftentimes will use the same vendors again and again. You know, they won't use the creativity that we're so used to here in Silicon Valley. So that may have been one of the first things. But really, in a good request for proposal, you're going to define your elements, the structure, the features you want. Like I said, use your creativity. Don't be limited by current technology or functionality. And I think that may have gone wrong. You've got to understand the regions you need to work in. So in this case, it was US. They're very fortunate it was only US. Because if this would have been a site that was global, that had all of the EU rules and all of the rest of the world privacy rules and security procedures that would have been required here, this thing would have been even more of a bust. And I don't think they could have turned it around as quickly as they did. Because when you start going global, you just complicate matters, you know, exponentially, as many of you are probably aware. Your user interfaces, I'm of the school that used to call it a GUI, but I guess it's more, there's so many aspects, and people specialize in this. They know these things. There are software people that spend their whole career working on those, and those are the ones you should be talking to and getting ideas about, especially on something like this. Your regulatory, like I said, you've got to know your HIPAA rules. You need to know your private health information. You've got to know your children COPPA, your Children Online Privacy Act. You've got to know the financial rules, GLB. You've got to know SEC's concerns on risk and data security. You've got to have NIST standards. I mean, you just have to know the gamut, and you've got to pick a vendor or a select several vendors who are going to really know that even better than you. I already mentioned privacy, and then the other piece is just to benchmark. Go around, find out, hey, I'm a consumer. I like this one. You've seen trends. You want to be at least on trend. You might want to go a little bit more trendy, but you want to be at least on trend. You don't want to look like Office 95. You don't want to look, completely new. Nobody knows what to expect. Go to the bottom and click on the terms of use, things like that. So you want to be somewhere in there. And then figure out your schedule. When are you going to award the business? What kind of money are you putting to this? What are your schedules of time? Because as we will talk about in a future slide, there's several stages that you have to anticipate here. So.
To what degree is there value in kind of building out your proposal and building out what you're looking for here on the basis of kind of existing standards and existing well used or well understood sort of standards, and to what degree is that relevant in a government context versus a commercial context? Do you have any thoughts about kind of use of standards here?
I do. I would be overruled perhaps by the government procurement folks, but at the end of the day, I think it would be wrong for them to think that they could, because they're the government and it's a government-run site, that they don't have to worry about the NIST standards, WISP. These are the security voluntary at this point. NIST standards align how you should be designing the use of information and how you should manage your back end. It's untenable to think that they might not have thought that through, but maybe that's what the problem was, is they overthought that. Because they were so worried about security and about being able to go to a secure website, they had too many authentication steps along the way. The other is the collection of financial information. These are PCI standards. So these would be the things that any e-commerce site has to be aware of. And then I also would think, and I don't know if this site allows for mobile, but I think you should be thinking about mobile. Are people going to want to have an app for this? Yeah, probably. Or they're going to at least want to be able, and they probably already do, on their mobile phones. So think through all of those kinds of things. I think it's very valuable.
Makes sense. So, one of the things that kind of was a big complaint with this particular rollout was the massive amount of downtime that was experienced and the massive number of features and functionality that wasn't available either at all or at various points in time. Can you speak to kind of how downtime, how you should be addressing downtime in the context of these sort of large development and large rollout contracts? Should there be some sort of service level agreements and things of that sort to kind of address these sorts of issues? What are your thoughts about kind of how kind of actual rolled out kind of commercial projects of this sort should be managed from a standpoint of downtime?
Great question. I think it's malpractice for a lawyer to be on a deal and not include something about service levels, especially a deal like this. So I would imagine they had them. Maybe it wasn't tight enough. Maybe it was. Or maybe when you think about it, is it just money you want back? Because service levels, if they don't make them, oftentimes what you'll build into the contract is getting a big, a credit. Okay, I pay you $100,000 a month. You miss the 99.999% uptime, then I get credit back. So I end up only paying you $70,000 this month. Is that good enough here? That kind of thing. So you really have to think it through. You certainly should have had that. Maybe they did, and we'll never know. I don't know if we get to see these contracts or not. But those are things you want to put in there. You also want to think about incentives. So the idea of getting a service level credit, the vendor or the manager of that site or whoever creates that site is going to want to be able to make that money back somehow. They are coin operated. I hate to say that. I don't know if anybody here in the room actually does that kind of work, but really money does talk. So if they have also built in the contract, okay, you're going to get dinged for missing my uptime, but if you do this, 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 and this to my great satisfaction, you have a chance of earning that back, or at least part of it back. You don't want to earn all of it back because you want them to be responsible and accountable for that downtime. But the earning it back could be, hey, you build better infrastructure. It never happened, or you write up another side code that then bypasses that problem immediately. Because downtime on a site like this is like fatal. People won't come back. They just won't. And in this case, you have just, mom and pop in any part of the world just go, my gosh, I got to do this. I'm going to have to pay a tax penalty. And they hit a blank screen. It's very uncomfortable user behavior. So I would have used, if it were me doing that, I would have tried to come up with something very creative, including that they had a fail-safe mechanism in the background, always having this is really basic stuff, but a second server for failover. Or many servers. I'm sure there were many servers, but they must have failover. They needed people to be able to deal with whatever happened immediately, put an end to and then move over. And they should have been able to get some kind of incentive credit for that.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's participatory, but
No,
please. This really wants to be informal.
you described you could write a clause that has some sort of penalty for downtime or some sort of bonus for exceeding. How much does the lawyer participate in actually the design of the system to make it fail safe? Are you going to write that into the deal that you're going to have X number of servers backup, or do you leave that up to the vendor to figure out how to conform and you just give them the incentives or the deterrents?
Well, that's a really good question, because you do have to ask yourself, is the deal big enough that you need to look at those? Usually those would be in the schedules, the way they write out they build out the LAN or the servers and all of this. And you do leave it up to the clients to figure that out, because unless you happen to have that skill set, you're not going to really be able to assess it. However, on a deal like this, I think you would have asked, it would have been a good idea to sit down and look at that schedule. They need to build it, but you need to sit down and look at it and say, okay, is this really going to do the job? I mean, it's common sense.
Yeah, I think the other point here is, you can write these contracts in a way that flesh out these issues up front. In other words, if you kind of hold, the vendors, the developers' feet to the fire as far as committing to being able to kind of accomplish certain objectives, in my experience, you get pushback from the vendors and developers to the extent that you're asking for things that are kind of beyond the pale, or that are kind of too strict from a legal perspective. You say, well, this needs to operate in this way, and it needs to have this sort of performance and this sort of uptime, and those sorts of demands will also flush out to the extent that what the vendor's intending to put together from an architecture or technical perspective won't really meet those objectives. You'll tend to flush those out in their pushback to different areas of the contract, and that can be an opportunity to kind of drive a better discussion about how the project really should be architected and how it really should be put together technically, whether or not you are the expert to actually describe and propose those technical solutions. You can drive the negotiation in a way that fleshes those issues out and kind of encourages those technical discussions to happen up front, rather than in a much more unfortunate way on the back end. And so I think those sorts of, kind of driving those negotiations and kind of nailing down, very specific requirements and kind of getting confirmation from the vendors that they're going to hit all these requirements up front will tend to kind of flush out kind of architectural problems that may arise, assuming that your vendor is actually competent enough to recognize when they can and cannot kind of actually meet those objectives. So I think that's a great question. I think that also kind of goes to kind of one of the next topics I wanted to talk about, which is how do you manage this sort of a development process. So, to what degree kind of, I know that there's going to be changes along the way, there's going to be issues that pop up. What are your thoughts, kind of what is your experience with kind of how you manage this sort of development, and what sort of committees and things like that should be in place to kind of approve things? What sort of structure should be in place from a kind of milestone and other perspective to kind of manage the development of these projects along the way?
Yeah, great. One of the schedules has to be a schedule of time and very, very specific milestones, and money should follow on meeting that milestone. So the way I like to do these contracts is there, and as was mentioned, these things can be hundreds of pages long. It depends on how large and what. And if in this case, for example, another way for the lawyer to know whether or not the deal is, or the way they're planning to deploy is kind of realistic, is when you look at all the RFP responses, there may have been some other ways that you saw on some of the other vendors that didn't get the job. So there, you kind of get you keyed into asking things. But anyways, the three structures, first is the ramp up. How are you going to decide what's the scope? How are you going to build up the servers? What are the milestones along the way? What are the tester groups? How are we going to look at it? And how do we pay for that along the way that we have given our sign off? The second aspect of the contract needs to cover just your steady state. Once you give your green, so you got pre-production, you got your steady state, and then you have your inevitable problem wind down. If you do have to terminate, or if there's a reason you're bringing it back in-house, or if you're going to a new vendor, or there's a whole brand new system that needs to get put in place, or let's say your vendor goes away, they file for bankruptcy, what have you, you really need to cover all those three phases in the contract. So back to the question on schedules and milestones, just be real diligent about understanding what those need to be. And it's not enough to just say, and really this is probably one of the hardest parts, to be honest, because the lawyer doesn't always want to get involved in all these schedules, because some of them can be 30 and 40 long. But at the end of the day, you really need to advise your clients, work with them to really be specific, because it's going to be, money's going to be tied to it if you do it right. And those milestones, if they fail to meet it, you're going to have a backup plan, figure out, well, because you're going to, if you meet one, you're going to then meet all, you're probably going to miss all the other ones, right? Unless they can figure out how to do that. So a lot of that comes in there. I also, in very big projects, I do ask the clients to bring a third party in and do some testing. Or, maybe that could have helped here. Just a few, average folks coming in and just try it out. It's a really, really helpful tool. Yes?
So I think one of the kind of interesting things about the launch of Healthcare.gov was, I think, both from the vendor side and also from the government side, there's sort of a lapse in sort of a critical assumption that went in. So if you think, one of the biggest challenges about why it was so kind of from a user perspective, one of the issues about why it was so broken was that they asked for a lot of information up front. They did the eligibility determinations up front, which was kind of a critical assumption, which both the vendor and the feds from their side, they from their perspective, it was a perfectly good flow. But those had very pretty harsh implications in terms of what the technology and what the architecture would be. But those are kind of a lapse on both party sides. And so how do you deal with those kinds of issues?
It's a very interesting point, because if the people who are the ones in charge of putting the schedules together and getting the contracts going are the ones that are making the flawed assumptions, you're going to get what you get. But again, they might have been able to, if they just had a practice of bringing in, John Q. Public and trying it out along the way, that might have been able to help. When it comes to changing how our government does their procurement, I don't think anyone in this room thinks we're going to be able to get that to change, but maybe, just maybe, this was a good learning lesson on how, people lost their jobs, really, over it, and that happens in companies, too. So it's really a good idea to think ahead of what are your roadblocks going to be, and it might be because people are doing things, they're used to doing things the way they've always done them. and figure a way to bring in a new voice. And that happens in companies too, where your IT person, CIO's been in place a long time, but you as a lawyer have seen a lot of different deals, and you know there might be something he could learn from having look at it slightly different. It's very delicate, but in that case, probably the same story.
I think one relevant point that's kind of, people talk about, gee, why was this so failed? Why is it that if, companies can do this so much better, why is it that the government can't do this? And, one of the mantras that we have here in Silicon Valley, if you kind of read books like The Lean Startup and others, one of the things that people talk about regularly in the context of development is something called minimum viable product. And that's the idea that you start by scaling something to what's absolutely necessary to get the job done. You get the minimum level of features, the minimum level of functionality that you need to actually make this thing work. And then you talk about kind of building and expanding from there. You don't start by kind of specifying the moon and describing the most complex infrastructure possible and then try to back off when things fail. And so the reality is, some of those sorts of lessons that we can teach from Silicon Valley about things like minimum viable product are relevant and may have been kind of a different way of approaching things, a lean sort of development that was kind of start simple and build out once you have the simple thing working. May have been something that kind of would have produced a different result, or at least have some sort of failover back to a simpler version of the website that actually did accomplish at least some minimum goals. And so rather than having a very complex system that in some cases was completely unusable and could provide zero functionality, it's certainly possible. And, I don't know that we have all of the information to be able to speak to how things might play differently, but certainly it's something that, my clients in Silicon Valley will focus on from a development perspective, is kind of starting simple, starting with the basics and creating a minimum viable product before you kind of try to build out every possible feature functionality. If you look at some of the specifications that they did publish for this for this project, the dependencies were staggering. And friends of mine that actually do kind of large scale development, looking at this, kind of said to me that this is a staggering set of dependencies to even hope to be able to produce something over the time frame that they were hoping to produce here. Because if you looked at it, there were requirements that this system first, once you gave them your minimum information, first reached out to Experian to check to make sure that it had basic data about you, that you were a real person, and then you had certain other they would check your social security number against certain things, and then it checked against certain other internal government databases to make sure they could verify your income, verify all these other things. All this eligibility and all of this front end sort of dependencies created a massive number of different possible fail points in this deal. And so, whether that was an architectural problem or not, I'm not the expert to be able to say, but it certainly wasn't the simplest approach. It certainly wasn't an approach that had any hope of working if any one point along the way failed. And so I think those sorts of kind of massive multiple dependency situations are certainly the ones that are most likely to create these sorts of issues. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, since you mentioned dependencies, maybe this is like pivoting a little bit, we might get to this, but when I'm negotiating on the side of, so I'm at Google, right, and people are giving us inbound technology, I've been surprised in the SLAs that they are excluding services that they're getting outsourced from other partners, so that the dependencies that I'm relying on, because they're supposed to provide me the packages, like the satellite truck, if it's like they're encoding and they're doing live streaming, it's like supposed to be an end-to-end solution. But the SLAs give major carve-outs if a party is relying on another partner. And so I was surprised in how much pushback I've been getting to that. I want to hear how each of you deal with that in terms of, I want an end-to-end solution and I want them to be responsible for subcontractors and I want to cover an SLA. And then also, I've also seen them try to get out of things in terms of like the force majeure. So not just because of the SLA, sure, but because they say it's outside of their reasonable control. And so in both of those situations, how have you
I'll let Sue kind of speak to some of the details of how you deal this internally within the company, but in general, kind of at a high level, part of the issue, and I'm not saying this is an issue at Google, is you need to be prepared to pay for it. If you really are asking a vendor to be end to end and kind of a comprehensive, commitment that this thing is going to work come hell or high water, you need to be prepared to pay for it. You need to be able to say, that's fine. You are now taking on your own, not just your own risk, but every vendor that's providing services, product, technology to you, that you are standing behind that, which means to some degree you need to be stepping up, you vendor need to be stepping up to basically ensure some of these things that you can't control. You need to be having backup vendors for each of the vendors you choose. You need to have backup technology solutions if something turns out to have a problem. And so that absolutely is a real problem, but it's a problem that comes in part because a lot of customers aren't prepared to write the check that really should be written to cover that sort of thing. And so they're looking for the low-cost solution and at the same time looking for that level of commitment, which I think is entirely reasonable as long as the customer is prepared to pay for it. And the reality is, a lot of these things can be better insured or managed at the customer level where, the reality is in certain cases, customers can purchase insurance to cover certain kinds of failures that might come up in a way that a vendor can't if they're not going to be the ones actually experiencing the failure at the end of the day. And so it is a complex issue, and it's one that from a customer perspective can be incredibly frustrating because, you're asking for, a solution that works and a commitment that it will continue to work. And that seems like a very simple ask. And I think the reality is as a vendor, you'll often see that it may not be as simple as that for the vendor to actually sign up to that unless they have the funds and resources to be able to have multiple source vendors on each piece, have insurance to back that up, and have the ability to kind of fail over to a completely alternate site if things fail. If you're ready to pay for all of that, I think the reality is you can find vendors willing to do that. A lot of the kind of agile, small Silicon Valley vendors that you're looking at have zero experience kind of being able to put together that sort of a kind of fail-safe, secure, come hell or high water sort of system. And I think that can be an issue that as a company trying to make things happen in Silicon Valley, you struggle with actually getting the commitment you really want. But, why don't you speak to kind of the real world?
I think it's a great question because as the buyer in that case, you really should be able to say, I want the full solution. Tell me what, and we'll work on price, okay. But at the end of the day, I don't want you to have all these carve-outs. I didn't choose your vendor. You did. If you're going to use XYZ as your back end, I won't say names or anything, but if they're going to be your internet provider, and your system goes down, but you owe me a duty, because of the contract, that it's your responsibility to make sure you get that uptime right away. It's not my business. It's your business. You're an IT company, right? Or you're the developer. So I think we're kind of mixing a little bit. We are making an assumption that the developer here is also the provider of the site. That is a lot of times the way it works. But you could just contract with the web developer, and then someone else steps in, and actually maintains the site. Maybe even your own internal people maintain the site. So, there's various levels of business models that could be done here. But the one common thread is that somebody has to pay for those force majeure events. Somebody has to pay for the downtime. And so it's really a matter of just be aware and fight as hard as you can when you're the buyer for some sort of recourse. You may not get everything you want, but at least some sort of recourse. And it is very common for those vendors to try to say, not my problem. Sorry, it is their problem.
Have you negotiated that clause itself? Because sometimes you can see that the force majeure actually carves out the SLA.
It does.
Gives it a big carve out. So have you had success changing the wording so that it doesn't say beyond its reasonable control, including outages? Like, or do you just kind of that's industry standard? There's nothing we can do about it.
It's a great question again, and I never accept that it's industry standard, but I think you can get some movement. Just get it to be more specific. In the interest of being more specific so that we each know when this really occurred, let's talk about this a little bit more. So it isn't just because I decided there's a force majeure. Vendor decides there's a force majeure. that you both know what are those trigger points. We probably should move on to another slide. It's a really good question, though. Yeah.
Having come from a vendor where we would provide large IT, I think it came down to, for us, because in the negotiations this became such a critical sort of a legal point that would tie up the rest of the deal, that we ended up sort of breaking it down in terms of criticality of the service that we're providing, right?
Right.
So what we would say is, if it's critical and we didn't have a second vendor or redundancy built in, then we would then commit to an SLA.
Right.
Versus other things that where, if it was, and again, criticality, whether it's critical, there's multiple dimensions to it, and we valued sort of what the user experience was going to be as sort of the most critical dimension, and then our SLAs would be then set up to support that. And also things that weren't critical, where it was more back-end functionality as opposed to front-end, then what we would sit there and say is, look, we're carving it out of the SLA, and we have these redundancy backup plans that we would then work with in terms of doing that. Because that, when we reframed our SLAs, especially as a vendor, it helped with the negotiations a lot when we talked about it enough.
Someone else had a comment? We probably should move on to the next one.
Yeah, well, and there's not really, I mean, we've probably gone through some of these.
That one's good.
Yeah.
Scope creep, though, I wanted
Sure.
to talk
We
about.
can talk about that.
Because scope creep's really interesting, and if you think about it, it's going to happen. You want to say, oh, you better think about everything right up front. It just isn't human nature. We're not going to remember, we're not going to think of everything right up front. You're going to learn new things. So the way to structure these deals is really important, to set up some sort of change control mechanism, even in the first phase, which is the pre-production phase, the visiting. So if it's different and beyond the scope of what you had agreed, you have some sort of a board, a council, something of executives or at least senior people in the room, so it's not just your technologists doing scope creep. Now, when you're the buyer of services, you kind of like scope creep, right? Because you don't want to have to pay for more. But when you're the seller, they're going to not want any scope creep at all. So you've got to find a happy medium in there. And so the fair thing I have found is to have some sort of a board and a process that when it's a significant change, it needs to be documented. It gets signed off by, it doesn't have to be a senior, most senior person. It just needs to be someone you identify in the company or in the government, if that were the case, that basically says, we agreed that this is new. We agreed, maybe you want to negotiate that there's no price change, but you might not win that one, depends on what side you're on. But at least you have a documentation that says you now have something new. Unfortunately, in the case of this Healthcare.gov, they didn't have the luxury of, they had scope creep, but they didn't have the luxury of adding more time. Because a lot of times scope creeps means you need some extra time to get something done. So I would revert back to Adit's comment on something like that and say, wait a minute then, we want that. That's nice to have, but let's do that in the next phase. Because we need to get something out on, what was the date, 3/31/2014. And so, and really resist the scope creep. Don't get rid of it altogether, but put it off for the next phase improvement. And for those of you who do a lot of software deals as well, you know this. This is these phase gate things where we identify, a lot of times software companies, what they do, they get all these things. Every single day they get new features and ads and things that people want, and unless it's a critical bug, they just put it in a list. And then they will plan on having a release every, month, week, whatever it is, but it's a true official release where all those go in because of all the quality control requirements. Well, you get the same thing on web design, exactly the same thing. If they start just sort of willy-nilly changing this, they don't know what they messed up over there. So you do need more of a, what do they call it, like a freeway schedule where, you know that it's you're going to hit that exit, in a month, and so we'll put them all in there. Now, critical bugs, different story, right? So if the scope creeps because there was a real problem, they've got to be fixed right away. And that's another matter altogether.
I think both to the last point of kind of carve-outs for other vendors as well as the point here on kind of scope creep and major bugs, one of the things that we didn't kind of focus on early on, but one of the things that was a big issue here was it turned out there was a different vendor that was providing, quote, the front end for this site and another vendor that was providing the back end. And neither one of them was a sub to the other. They were both direct contractors to the government here. And that enabled a huge amount of finger pointing, which is what happened in every kind of snafu like this. But in particular, when you have two kind of primary vendors like you do here, there's a huge opportunity for everybody to finger point. A, when there was a problem with delay. B, when there was a problem with any major bug. But also, whenever anything new came up, like, well, gee, we need to solve for this or this. Everybody was like, well, that's not really my part of this. Especially in a fixed price contract and a fixed deadline contract, there's huge motivation to say, well, that's clearly their problem. That's clearly their responsibility. And so, I mean, you know, in hindsight, it's obviously easy to say, but I think once again, having a single point of contact and a single point of responsibility is critical. And not having that single point of responsibility have an ability to either finger point or carve out and say, this is not my problem and this is something you need to deal directly with so-and-so about. And that sort of opportunity that comes for finger pointing from having multiple vendors on the same project, neither of whom has any particular responsibility to each other, created, I think, you know, certainly some of the issues that we saw here as well. One thing I should mention, though, from the standpoint of what I see in the real world is a huge amount of the projects that are going on have some dependency on AWS, on Amazon Web Services, as a back-end provider of service to kind of major projects. And there is a significant trend in my experience right now for people saying, hey, we can't be responsible for AWS going down. We've clearly seen it's not bulletproof. And if you want us to use it, if you're telling us that's what you want us to build this on, we will, but it needs to be the customer's problem. And you need to have, if you need SLAs directly from AWS about their ability to keep basic core services up, you're going to have to talk to them about that. They will do it for you for, you know, an appropriate fee, but that's not something that we can warrant or that we can be responsible for. And at the end of the day, you need to kind of negotiate directly with AWS for that. That is not a good trend from a customer perspective, and one that I think, you know, I hope that more customers will be resisting going forward, because it just creates a huge amount of opportunity for people to, once again, finger point or create, you know, a kind of a cloud, no pun intended, kind of questionable responsibility when things actually go wrong. But I think that is definitely a trend that I'm seeing more and more of lately, which is kind of, you know, a demand to carve out AWS. And I'm assuming, you know, as other competitive kind of major cloud services from IBM and others come to be kind of, you know, real competitors, we're going to start to see the same sort of request for carve out for all of the kind of core cloud service back-end providers, the cloud infrastructure providers. And so, once again, as a vendor, I totally understand the request, but as a customer, I think I'm not seeing as much pushback as I would have thought to that demand that people carve out AWS from their set of responsibilities.
I think that's it's a very good point. However, in the event that it is, the thing that I try to resist, if it is our decision to go with AWS or that, but the vendor will just completely disclaim any liability for anything associated with that. What I try to do is say, okay, look, I know I've asked you to do this. I'll take that responsibility, but you are my IT person and I want you to be dealing with them. And so I want you to get into that contract. Yes, we can build that into the agreement that maybe there's a certain amount of additional a schedule or something about how that coordination occurs, and you get a little extra cash for this. I can, you know, but at the end of the day, I don't want to be the one I don't want you to be coming to me and say, well, the reason for that downtime is them, and then I got to go deal with them. So, you know, it's really kind of an end-to-end, and it does depend, because most likely they will do some sort of disclaimer. You know, the vendor will say, well, you told me to do it this way, because there are choices where you can have your own server farm set up just for you, even with a third party, as you all know, or you can use more of a public cloud associated. So, you know, it is a choice. It's just a matter of who's got to deal with it, right? So the last thing I would just say, you know, and we talked about finger pointing a little bit already, but is just another thing to help with finger pointing is just to establish user groups, you know, get people to be in from those different parties that are supposed to work together, And be sure that you have representation from all of them, as well as your own people who might be, you know, like the John Q. Public point. But at the end of the day, to have hacker days, to involve them, give incentives to your prime contractor. That's how I like to view it. Who's your prime versus who are your subs? And give incentives to the prime to work and play nice in the sandbox with all the subs. Then, you know, but you're still going to hold them ultimately accountable. It doesn't always work that way, but on a project as big as this, it might have helped. Yeah. So
I think, you know, just one final point that's really, you know, as much kind of business as legal is just one of the things that was missing here probably to some degree and is missing in a lot of large internal projects as well as transparency. And I think that is a point that, you know, probably bears kind of, you know, repeating here, which is, you know, in a government context, the politics kind of, I'm sure, motivate against kind of transparency for these sorts of failures and really kind of letting people in on all the details of it. But this is not just a government, that's not just a government issue. It's very common in internal politics and companies, as well as interactions between companies and vendors, which is, it is always difficult to kind of flag issues early and saying, and kind of letting people know, whether it's vendors letting customers know, or whether it's customers escalating internally and letting their bosses know, hey, looks like we're having a problem, you know, this is what it looks like, it's probably going to impact this and that and the other thing, and here's the worst case scenario based on this issue. That sort of transparency is very difficult to accomplish, but, you know, the reality is, you know, whatever level, you know, you're in, whether you're an internal customer that has people you're reporting to, or whether it's a vendor reporting to a customer, transparency can solve a lot of this and really can make, you know, can dramatically mitigate the costs and downsides of these sort of issues. And I think that's something that we saw here, and it's something that's really kind of a lesson for kind of real world commercial development as well. I think we're out of time, but if anybody has any questions, happy to talk.
Let's see, how does this go? One more? Oops, why don't you move it forward? There we go. So any questions? I will say one last thing, because I really appreciate the opportunity here. I really believe in councils. I believe in councils with a C, not an S, but that you arrange ahead of time. So for change control, for pricing changes, and also the transparency that Adit was just talking about. The one for transparency includes your executives, you have your dispute resolution process, but then make sure your contract does cover that if the dispute resolution process doesn't work, what do you do next? Can they shut you down or while you're going to court? No, but that would be a really strong incentive. And if you don't prevent that in the contract, you know, as part of the dispute, you know, you might find yourself surprised. So really do be careful and think through all the worst things that could happen, but all the best things too. So thank you for your attention. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.